Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited to be moderating this panel and discussion on the Leadership Challenge, Tackling Trade-Offs and Tensions for a Sustainable Future. My name is Dusya Vera, and I am a professor of strategy at the Ivey Business School and executive director of the Ian O. Ignatowicz Institute for Leadership, an institute dedicated to generating new knowledge and research in the area of character leadership and through our teaching and outreach to developing global citizens who have strength of character, strive to make a difference, and contribute to the flourishing of teams, organizations, communities, and societies. Thank you for joining us for the last Ivey Impact Live episode on the ESG series. The first session brought to you ESG experts who discuss the evolving landscape of ESG and where the ESG agenda is going. The second session dove into standardized ESG reporting and disclosure and the implications for Canadian businesses. Today, we will explore ESG from the angle of leadership and ask, what are the competences and what is the character required of leaders to successfully engage in ESG work and to lead ESG strategies? Think, for example, about the courage needed to have some of the difficult conversations that surround ESG and to say things that may be unpopular. Consider the question of accountability combined with our sense of justice. Who are we accountable to? The answer could be very narrow, we're accountable to shareholders, or it could be inclusive, we're accountable to ourselves and to many others, including clients, employees, society, and the planet. Think about transcendence or the ability to be visionary and how that can help to find solutions that solve not only the problems we have created, but to have the purpose and the creativity to generate a future where human flourishing is at the center. Consider the combination of collaboration, temperance, humility, and drive that enables dialogue that is patient, where we listen to others and where we learn together, and dialogue that fuels action and tri-sector collaboration. During our panel discussion, we will explore the different ESG tensions and trade-offs facing leaders today. Tensions such as those between short-term financial performance and long-term ESG goals, shareholders and stakeholders, ESG and competitiveness, regulatory compliance and operational efficiency, purpose and profit, reputation and risk management. In the next hour, we will also discuss how leaders are embracing these tensions with both and thinking. We are all very familiar with either or scenarios that force a choice between options, but both and embraces tensions and use creativity to create better decisions for complex problems. Before we start, I would love to hear your opinion on ESG and invite you to participate in the following quick poll that you're going to see on your screen. The question is, do you think ESG strategies are delivering impact and results? And you have multiple options there. So let's give it a minute to see what you're thinking. Okay, so we have 59% of you are thinking partially, okay, partial, in between. And we have 19% for yes, 12% for no, and then 10% I don't know. So that's going to be helpful for our panelists to know where the audience, what the audience is thinking. So partially. Before we start, I am again excited to discuss these issues with our three panelists. They were all part of the North American Atlantic roundtables that the Ignatowicz Leadership Institute held in partnership with the Long Run Institute earlier this year on the topic of character, leadership, purpose, and ESG. You're going to see that our panel will offer diverse and important perspectives. Their formal bios are on the website, but we're going to post the link here in the chat, and I will introduce them briefly here. Duncan Fulton is the Chief Corporate Officer, Restaurant Brands International. JP Gladu is the founder and principal of Mokwateh, and a prominent Indigenous business leader. And Oana Branzei is the professor of strategy and sustainability at the Ivey Business School at Western University. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here. So we are going to start with the same question that we posed our audience, and it is, do you think ESG strategies are delivering impact and results? And what are you seeing to form that opinion? And I'm going to start with JP. Welcome,
Great.
JP.
Thank you so much, Dusya, and great to be on this panel with Oana and Duncan. I wasn't surprised with that response of partially. It's a point in time, though. It'd be interesting to see, though, that same poll, say, during COVID, or say after, maybe in the future again, when we start to see some stability in our energy sector across the country, because that has significant impacts on inflation and cost, obviously the cost of living. And as leaders, navigating the challenges of geopolitical instability, energy costs, operational excellence, safety, managing the relationship with our stakeholders, and also I want to suggest rights holders, who are the Indigenous people, which have a unique position in Canada as the only people recognized in Canada's Constitution. So no, I wasn't totally surprised that it's partially, and also we don't know, because the impacts that we see from global movements, I sit on an oil and gas company's board, Suncor. And a few years ago, there was a lot of rhetoric around turn the pipes off, shut off oil, advance that, look at the cost of oil and gas, look at the carbon tax, look at all these added expenses to the bottom line of Canadians, and recognizing that this is the transition is going to take time, the responsibility of organizations to find ways to sustainably produce. We're going to it's flip-flopped. Maybe we should think about oil and keeping the taps on until we get inflation under control and the transition. So is it it's all over the map, and again, it's a point in time, but we've got to continue, and I'm sure Duncan and Oana is going to have a lot of great contribution here around maintaining that long-term vision for your organization and the impacts that it's going to have in the country, and as it relates to the environment, social, and governance. So this is an exciting conversation.
Thank you for getting us started, JP. Let me go to you, Duncan.
Thanks very much, Dusya. I'm old now. I still have a 4 in front of my age, but I'm at the very edge of that. So I think back 20 years when I had just left government and had gone into a consulting role, and I had clients where we were working with them on various ESG issues in 2004. Then I fast forward a decade to when I was at Canadian Tire in 2014 and leading the ESG initiatives there. And fast forward another decade now with my global role at RBI. And just kind of taking that 20-year view, it's like, how we doing? I think partially well is probably right today. And the way I look at it is, you've got these external pressures that are forcing change. Rarely does it come from inside companies. There's a few companies that are probably exceptions to that, but usually this is being forced by external pressure. And I would argue 20 years ago and even 10 years ago, those external pressures were not very focused. There were lots of different arguments and lots of different issues, and not a lot of coordination between NGOs and various interest groups. And the lack of focus and external pressure allowed companies to have a lack of focus and ultimately, in many cases, have an action. Then you've got the actions that companies are taking. And again, I go back 20 years and I think of, I won't name them, but some of the clients I worked on with this, they were very paper mache, their actions, like they weren't real and substantive. And I go back 10 years ago, and we actually at Canadian Tire hired the former head of ESG for Walmart North America, who I actually brought to one of Oana's classes when I did my MBA, and she was my prof. And we were getting into real tangible actions at that point. And then I think today, where I think there's a lot more focus on the actions, I would argue that the third way I look at it is like internally and your internal stakeholders. I still think there's grudging alignment from a lot of internal stakeholders, like not the ESG leaders, but the P&L leaders. And 20 years ago, I don't think we had alignment. 10 years ago, I think people saw it as cute and interesting. And I think today people see it as serious, but want to be very deliberate in picking a few things to have an impact. So I think we're at partially today, which is a heck of a lot better than where we were even a decade ago.
Yeah, thank you for that longitudinal perspective. Let me go to Oana.
That longitudinal perspective, it is so important because the results we're seeing today, those seeds were planted 20 years in the past, not necessarily in the strategies of companies, but in the minds and hearts of the leaders who are paying attention to shifts in social, cultural, and corporate expectations. Partially is a good answer. It's an answer that signals that we haven't arrived yet, that much is yet to learn, that much is still ongoing. And back to JP's point, much is still contingent, that just pointing the ESG strategy in the right direction, holding that proverbial north is not sufficient. It really depends on the turbulence that leaders encounter along the way. But I would say it's optimistic to look at the yes, and it's important to look at where these strategies have fallen short, because we're learning at the margins of success, and we're learning a lot at the margins of failure, as a lot of new regulations are coming in, are moving organization from that paper mache to much more vital and substantive action.
Great, thank you. So with that introduction, with that picture that we have in our minds about this partial, success or partial impact, let's move to specific examples of how leaders manage tensions, especially because ESG is right now discussed in a very polarized way. So we have people who find it essential, ESG is essential, people who find it inadequate, people who find it woke. So let's unpack leaders managing polarizations. This time I'm going to start with Duncan. Can you just share some examples, Duncan, of how you have seen others, or how you manage these competing priorities, and what advice can you give to leaders about managing competing priorities, and is there any way to find an both and thinking solution?
Yeah, but the example I'll give you is I'll pull from Burger King internationally. So we have Burger Kings in 120 countries around the world, more than 18,000 doors. And I think my direct answer to your question, how do you solve those competing priorities? Be led by your customers. If you are super focused on being led by the people who you sell things to and who you're ultimately accountable to, then you'll ultimately make the right decisions. And what we've seen in the last number of years, our customers around the world have said, I would like you and other companies to do better on reducing your carbon footprint. We say, fair enough. More than 2/3 of our global footprint. Again, we have Tim Hortons, Burger King, Popeyes, Firehouse Subs. We have 31,000 locations around the world. More than 2/3 of our carbon footprint comes from beef. And so we have to then resolve beef. And the answer is not get out of the beef business, because the same customers that want us to solve our carbon footprint love the Whopper. And they don't want a veggie Whopper. And we've tried it, and we've launched it in a bunch of places. And you had a big sales surge for a couple of weeks, then people go back to beef. We did to Tim Hortons. We launched one of the brands of plant-based beef in our sausage sandwiches. Everyone tried it. Everyone went back to sausage. So you've got to be led by your customers, because you can make a mistake and say, okay, then we're going to pull back and go everything plant-based. And it's not what people want. So now you got this juxtaposition. People want carbon reduction, but they still want to eat beef. So that forces us to go then work with the beef industry to say, look, guys, we need to raise cattle with sustainable practices that reduce the carbon footprint by half, which is largely through methane emissions by cows and agriculture practices. So what we did is we went to Australia, which has the most traceability anywhere on the planet. And we worked with ranches where as soon as a cow is born, they get a GPS tag. So we can actually know which ranches those cattle were on, because they often get traded or move around ranches. We worked with ranch owners who used regenerative agriculture practices. So as the cows moved from pasture to pasture, they were planting cover crops to retain more, pull more carbon out of the air, long grasses that plant that carbon 6, 8 feet into the ground. And Australia actually has a measurement system and a credit system where now farmers can sell back to the government carbon credits and be paid for it. So now there's financial incentive for farmers to spend more money on cover crops rather than just leaving the field bare and it grows back when it does. Then we can track those cows all the way to slaughter. Within 3 carcasses, we can actually track the cow all the way through the slaughter process, all the way into the process to make a hamburger. And when we did that, we had to find out how much does this cost. And what we did over the course of a year is we discovered we achieved about a 46% reduction in carbon, measured and verified by the Australian government's own standards, verified through the traceability of the cow from birth all the way through to a Whopper patty. And we discovered that as we made these hamburger patties, in the end, they were about 7 cents more than the patties that we're making now. So just do some rough math, multiply that by 5 or 6 by the time it goes through the whole supply chain and we have to sell it to you. And it's interesting. We asked our customers, hey, good news, we can get you 50% reduced carbon patties. Would you now like to pay 50 to 75 cents more for your burger? And they go, oh, hell no. I don't want to pay more for my burger. I just want you to fix it. So the fun thing for us is we've found a way to do it. It's more expensive than it needs to be, but now that we've done it once, it's kind of like the Wright brothers flying. You just need to prove that flight is possible, and then you can figure the rest out. So we'll get that down to near parity, but it's an example of like, it's not a straight line between reduce your carbon footprint, but don't take away my burger. And for the love of God, don't charge me more for my burger. You have to go and figure this out with a lot of different partners.
Yeah, it's a great example. And again, you're saying, listen to your customers, see how that input helps in this balance. Thank you for that example. Let me go to JP. JP, Indigenous communities often have deep-rooted values around sustainability and stewardship. How can these values inform leadership approaches in today's business? And particularly, again, in these tensions between economic growth and environmental responsibility. Can you share some examples with us of what businesses and organizations can learn from Indigenous leadership principles when creating and implementing, again, how to resolve these tensions, how to have a both and thinking solution?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I did want to quickly reflect on Duncan's comments there about the hell no, not paying more. It's like careful what you ask for, because you might start to see the stark truth that change can cost you. But what is the value of that change, and what are you willing as an individual to help assist that change, particularly when it comes to carbon and environment? I'm somebody that's very familiar with the natural resource sector, and I see it all the time. And you can imagine, I'm First Nation. I'm actually in Coast Salish territory today in Vancouver, but I'm normally on my reserve, Northern Ontario, where there's mining, there's a gas line. I'm a forester by training, so harvesting trees, and it's and so there's a this thought or this idea by Canadians that us as First Nations people are anti-resource development. And that's not the truth at all. It's actually quite the opposite. And as Indigenous people, we bring, since time immemorial, and I'm a big land user. Last week, I was out on the land hunting moose, and I produced my own burger with the moose that I got this week, Duncan. So that's just, I don't have to. I can create my own Whopper at home. My daughter's coming hunting with me with that knowledge transfer later this month. And so we bring all that knowledge to the forefront in everything that we do. However, it's not without challenge and trade-off as well, to Duncan's story. For a long time, Indigenous people have been very much on the peripheral of society and, stuck on reserves, not allowed to participate in the economy or in any way, or even hire lawyers, etc. I won't go into too much detail, but all of a sudden, things have shifted significantly when the ESG perspective. I'm going to go back to the fur trade. I got a little bit to make a long story longer here. Yeah, the example I wanted to draw on is from my friends from Fort Mokwateh First Nation. Chief Jim Boucher, he's no longer chief, he's third chief for 30 years, an incredible leader. He was around when the green movement to cancel out the fur trade of Indigenous people had significant impact. So they made a really good living in the fur trade, like hundreds of dollars for furs, et cetera, and it was the only living that Indigenous people had to the oil and gas to the fur trade being cut out, and now the oil and gas sector's on their front door, and they're seeing the impact. So they fought the oil and gas sector for many years. And then the recognition came that maybe we can influence the oil and gas sector to do it better, as well as benefit, because much of the natural resources have been being extracted from our territories. We saw no benefit. All we saw was the mess. And now we're becoming equity owners in energy projects. Our procurement policies in this country and the private sector are strong. Now our communities are starting to proliferate. So managing wealth is a really interesting opportunity when you've been managing poverty for so long. But it doesn't come without the trade-offs. And so Indigenous communities have a strong sense of what is acceptable for development and what is not. The oil and gas sector pushed on many of the territories, and the communities made concessions. They've started businesses, but then it comes to a point where they pushed a little bit further. So the communities said no. So Moose Lake is this beautiful area, and I've been up there a couple of times moose hunting, fishing with my First Nation friends up in northern Alberta, and they said no, we're drawing the line here because this is really important to our communities. So communities bring a real sense of land from that environmental and social perspective that they bring forward. But what we start to figure out is that Indigenous knowledge systems, when afforded the opportunity to be co-used as we go through regulatory processes in this country, Indigenous communities start developing the capacity, and they start actually creating their own environmental sustainability steward organizations within their communities that corporations now have to work with. So we're bringing this knowledge system to the forefront. Even in the Yukon, as an example, in the Northwest Territories, First Nations and in BC are starting to create their own Indigenous regulatory systems, which are used to strengthen the decisions around how we're going to do resource development. So we're using an Indigenous knowledge system alongside Western science because they're two different views. You can't plug one into the other. So having knowledge holders at the table to guide us in the way that we advance in this particular situation, resource-based activities, and it's strengthening the outcomes because you're being inclusive. It's an exciting place to be in this country. The country is lining up behind Indigenous capacity through loan guarantee programs. Provincial governments have them through equity ownership and infrastructure. And it's a long time coming, a few hundred years now, where Indigenous people are finally coming to the forefront with our knowledge systems, and our aspirations are starting to be co-developed alongside other companies in this country. So it's a really interesting, evolving space for sure.
Thank you. Yeah, fascinating. I love how you call it, co-use, the co-use of this knowledge. Thank you for that. Oana, let me ask you to finish this segment. Can you share with us also some examples of how business schools can help students and leaders learn to balance purpose and profit and shareholders and stakeholders?
Let's begin with the exemplary leaders in front of us on this panel that create a sense of possibility through their work, through their path to purpose, by showing that it is absolutely possible to balance profit and purpose. I would give a nod to two very recent initiatives. Earlier this spring, we ran an ESG in Action marathon that really put learners in the front seat of defining what ESG means to their generation, in conversation with leaders across sectors, and very importantly, from both sides of the debate, the woke and anti-woke, but also acknowledging the multiple perspective, generational, sectoral, occupational, that come into the debate. And most, although much talking happened in both debate format and roundtable formats during this experience, the greatest learning came from the patience to listen to different points of view and the extraordinary work that it takes to be respectful and integrate other perspectives into how decisions are made, into the processes of engagement, so that nobody is forced into a particular course. Another very recent example is comes under the envelope of reconciling the business school. Multiple colleagues were involved with multiple communities and multiple ways to walk with two legs and see the world with two eyes, so that we can begin having the very tough conversation that move us away from, you know, the sacred cows of the business school, the property rights, to the rights to care for nature, from the idea of how decisions are made in the name of profit to how decisions are made for the greater good of the community, how profits are shared, from being in a very hierarchical sense that advanced the few to more equal ownerships and stakes in the care and the dissemination. And I would end by saying, thank you, Duncan, for nodding to regenerative agriculture, and thank you, JP, for nodding to regenerative forestry, and to much that we already know about regenerating the sensitive ecosystems we depend on. Our entire Center for Building Sustainable Value is on a mission to bring regeneration to the forefront of business education, not a moment too soon, since the World Economic Forum deems this the future of business, not just the future of sustainability.
Thank you, Oana. Let's move now to where the conversation is actually going. You know, JP talked about co-use, Oana just talked about debate and the conversations we had with the students. So let's talk about this idea of dialogue, which it sounds more and more like it's harder to have dialogue, especially the ESG discussion has been polarized, politicized in the media, and leaders need to manage these shifts and swings in the public discourse about ESG, both internally in the organizations and externally with external stakeholders. So I'm going to ask the same question to the three of you. And again, going back to who the leader needs to be and what the leader needs to know and do. In your experience, what role do leaders' competences and also their character play in facilitating this idea of open dialogue, especially faced with conflicting values and conflicting goals? So what is your perspective on dialogue and the leader's skills, competences, and character? I'm going to start this time with you, JP.
Okay, I thank you for that question, and you're hitting it there. It was resonating with me in a big way. In our communities, we often say, you know, the Creator gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Listen much more than you speak. You know, if I just reflect on my career, now that I'm in my early 50s now, I've had extraordinary experiences to learn from other leaders and to be around the table with other folks that didn't think or come from the same backgrounds as I have. You know, I've worked for provincial governments, federal governments, I've worked for industry, I've worked for my own First Nations, I've worked for tribal councils, I've worked for environmental organizations, NGOs. You know, it's afforded me the opportunity to gain perspective from the other side of the table. And I think that's the biggest opportunity and challenge in our country is we often say a lot of these tables that I've been a part of lately is to bring, unlikely bedfellows to the table, like what to experience each other's perspectives in a safe place that is sort of guarded, in a sense that we're not letting the, media or other influencers come in, where we can have real safe conversations about our values, about our aspirations. You've got to create those spaces where you can come together and learn and be compassionate from the other side of the table, to understand other people. And what you'll find out is that you're going to find many commonalities, and you're going to find common values. You're going to find common issues that folks can agree on. And that's where you've got to spend the time building the relationship, building trust. If you don't have the trust, and trust is always is being able to understand somebody's behavior and their actions. And if you can't build that trust, you're never going to be able to develop any kind of dialogue or safe place around the more challenging issues that you're not going to agree on. Spend the time finding out what you can do to find things that you agree on. And from a core competency or values, or what you need as an individual, as a human, you got to be patient. You have to be understanding. You said you got to listen. You really have to have compassion, empathy, and check the ego at the door. You're one person. You're not the smartest person in the room. You got to go in with that kind of attitude that there are other people there that have tremendous value that you're going to learn from. We don't learn a lot from speaking. We learn a lot more from listening, and understanding that, again, is really important. I've been learning a lot from you, from the three of you. So thank you. You just got to create the safe place to have these conversations, and then build on them.
Thank you, JP. Duncan, let's go to you.
Yeah, I think my response is very much like a first cousin of JP's. It's you have to actually start with valuing feedback. If you are arrogant enough to believe that you don't need feedback, then you're not going to be productive in a dialogue. In fact, you're not even going to seek the dialogue to begin with. I think you have to be willing to embrace the uncertainty of where that dialogue may take you, and at the same token, have some confidence in your own facts. I'll give you a great example. I'll use our Popeyes chicken brand as an example. Back in 2016, 2017, there was a movement called the Better Chicken Commitment, still around today. Very well-meaning folks wanting to see all chicken manufacturers and suppliers in the world come to a series of better welfare commitments for chickens. And a former version of us signed up for it. None of our competitors signed up for it. Not one other major QSR, quick service restaurant brand, signed up for it, but we did. And rewind now 4 years ago, and I think we began to get really serious about a lot of these various commitments and paths to actually deliver results. And a bunch of our team said, some of these things don't work. Like, some of these things that we committed to don't work. Others we need to strive for. Some of these don't work. So we said, like, what? One of the commitments is to look at breed type. And most folks, whether you look at a McDonald's or a Kentucky Fried Chicken or a Popeyes, or even when you go down to Loblaws, you go to supermarkets, most folks buy chickens that are a fast-growing breed, which means they are born, they grow, and they've been bred in a way that they grow extremely fast to get them to a size that they can go to slaughter and be moved through. It's just an efficient supply chain. There's a very credible argument to be made for why that is bad for the chicken's health. The biggest one is kind of near end of life. Some of the chickens can't stand up because their body weight versus their kind of leg development. That sounds horrible. The flip side is it's how the entire industry works. And ironically, going to a much slower growing breed of chicken, which is what a lot of these NGOs ask for, that would have a massive impact on our carbon footprint, Because if you want to double the life of a chicken, think of all of the soy and feed and electricity that all contribute to your massive carbon footprint. So there are these tensions and trade-offs. And we just published our latest results from the kind of the last year of work. And on the Better Chicken Commitment, we said, look, we've made great progress in some areas like better lighting, and requiring the folks that produce chickens for us to have a lighting standard. There's a new enrichment standard that we're putting in place. There's new key welfare indicators we're tracking for chickens. But we called up all these NGOs that are behind the Better Chicken Commitment, and we said, look, we're just not there on breed type for a bunch of good reasons. You may attack us for it, and you may boycott us for it, but we're just choosing to be honest with you because we're making progress on these three things, and we're kind of missing one or two other ones here, but look, we're going to keep going. And since we've published that, several of them have come back and said, look, they're winding up their fall campaigns and planning their spring campaigns. And they've said, because you're being honest, because you're showing progress, because you're engaging with us, and you seem legitimately open to dialogue, we're going to choose for now to focus on attacking others that have not done those things. But look, there's a great deal of uncertainty. When the team said we think we should call them up and tell them that we're failing on some of the things we promised, you can see a bunch of leaders out there go, for the love of God, don't do that. Don't admit failure, because then we'll be attacked. But being silent will get you attacked. And for the love of God, lying will get you attacked. So just try honesty and engagement. And we've actually found the partners, call them partners, but the NGOs that have pushed us quite a bit on this have been far more reasonable than most people would give them credit for if you're just honest about your progress.
You know, that's so brilliant, so simple and brilliant at the same time. I mean, look at Maple Foods, the issue there, be open and honest and upfront. And look up north of Victoria Mine, they told their CEO to not say anything, and look where that got them. You got to be transparent, and you need to own your, you know what, you got to be able to be accountable. And that's fantastic, Duncan. I enjoyed that story. I'm getting hungry though.
Yes. Oana, open dialogue, leadership and open dialogue. What is your perspective?
I will take the story to class tonight. These are such important examples of how important the leaders are, how important they are as not just decision makers, but makers and givers of sense in a world that's constantly changing, and appreciating, but also balancing these different pressures. And work that Dusya and I have done on the future of corporate social responsibility really put a spotlight on the role of character in managing this multiple rights holders, stakeholders, shareholders, and orchestrating conversations where different voices can come together and begin to change the system through these tensions, through these frictions. I think we often hear the word trade-off, and we think at profit on one side of a teeter-totter and purpose at the other. And we always think that we can only have more of one if we have less of the other, but that's exactly the opposite. We see a situation in which a leader's purpose, honed through tensions between character traits, is actually generating pathways to profitability that were not yet available because, new solutions, new partnerships, new strategies had not yet been put in place. So drawing back to the sense of, yes, there are conflicting values. Yes, there are conflicting goals. Not just out there for leaders, but in there as they try to make sense of these different perspectives. And we found some much through conversations with the two of you at the roundtables over the past year, that there are many ways in which different, seemingly opposite character traits create a lot of balance. Perhaps most intuitive, as Dusya has already mentioned in the introduction, is courage versus humility. This idea that leading in the forefront of these strategies requires a balance of both and in subtle ways, in owning up to what works, but also to what doesn't, in having those conversations, in having disclosure and honesty about what doesn't work, not just taking feedback, but giving feedback to how external demands are falling short of their own goals and expectations. Perhaps less intuitive, but very central to all leadership ESG matters is this balance between accountability and justice. And it's not just a small addition, add-on, afterthought of social justice or climate justice, but it is really baked in, as JP was mentioning, to how we relate to one another, how we relate to the environment. And last but not least, all of us deal in critical issues and grand challenges as citizens, as participants in our communities. And it's so important to keep hope alive through work, through transcendent character traits. But it is very hard to balance that urge to stay hopeful with the need to be deeply humane and deeply understanding, not just to our fellow humans, but also to our fellow non-humans as we embrace this strategy. So I think these examples are really strong reminders that leaders are leading the way, often by internalizing this conflict and creating this both and synthesis in how they think, in how they articulate why decisions are important to be made.
Thank you. And then time is flying, so I'm gonna move to take a question from the audience. We got some questions in advance, and we're also getting questions throughout this conversation. So I'm gonna read you one question which builds on what we have already discussed, but I think the audience just wants to really push our thinking. The question says, I am a big fan of seeking win-win solutions, win-win-win solutions, yet trade-offs are often unavoidable. Therefore, it seems not only important but critical to have a clear view of relative priority. When everything is urgent, nothing is urgent. In my view, our ability to deal with other goals is contingent on meeting the existential environmental challenge. What are your thoughts? So who wants to start with that one?
Let me dive on that one, Roma.
Yeah.
Our culture in our company is one of like ruthless prioritization. And we pick a few things and we deliver on them. There's another question in the chat that I was seeing about, like, how is this all practical with, private equity companies and hedge funds? We have an extremely large private equity company that owns 26% of our shares, and another major private equity company that owns another 6 or 7% of our shares. And they're fully aware of what we're doing on ESG and fully supportive of it if we choose 1, 2, or 3 super important things and deliver on it. This notion of everything you get criticized for, everything you might be interested in, and you build large teams, you kind of work on everything all at once, it doesn't work. And you have to pick priorities and you have to do them well. The other one I would say is, again, I also come back to, you got to listen to your customer. So we have a lot of people that have pushed us on single-use plastic reduction, and we produce a lot of single-use plastic around the world. I'll talk about Tim Hortons lids, and we've gone from a polystyrene to a polypropylene lid, way better plastic, more recyclable plastic. But we're pushed and said, get rid of coffee lids. First of all, you need a coffee lid because it's going to pour on you. So we tried a fiber lid. And what's really important in a takeout coffee lid is how it feels on your mouth. Because when you put like corrugated paper to your mouth, it tastes bad. In fact, a lot of the paper straws that we all have taste horrible. Like, I don't know a single person that likes paper straw. They're not good. So we actually tested when the UN was in Ottawa recently with one of their environmental COP rounds. We actually tested fiber lids in Ottawa because we made them and we thought we'd got really far on them, and we put them into 40 restaurants around Ottawa. You know what? Some politicians said, this is amazing, what amazing leaders Tim Hortons is for doing it. You know what the customers said? It tastes really bad. I hate them. I don't want to drink out of them. And then you go, okay, well, we can do fiber lids and have people go over and drink coffee from McDonald's and Starbucks. That's a really bad business outcome. So that doesn't mean we bail on fiber lids. It means we say to the people that are criticizing us for it, you may have to wait a couple more years until we can perfect a fiber lid that feels the same as a plastic lid. And we're committed to the journey, but we're going to be super practical. And it's one of the one or two things that we're going to get right.
Yeah.
Thank you. JP?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Duncan on you've got to be good at what you're supposed to be good at. If I can just, comment on some of the work we're doing in the oil and gas sector, it's like you've got to be good at operations, you've got to be good at safety, you've got to be good at managing your environmental impacts. And now we're being asked to be good at carbon management, and through reduction, through our machinery, through pathways project, through carbon capture utilization. But it all boils down to your strategy as a board of directors, as the executive, aligns behind the data and back to Duncan's comments around what are your customers, what are your stakeholders, what are the governments, what is everybody demanding of you? But you can't you can't keep going back and forth. Okay, they want this. Now the lid doesn't taste good, so now we got to do this. You've got to have your strategy. You've got to stick to it, because time and the environment will shift and it'll shift back. So if you're seen as a ping pong organization, you're going to have a very hard time meeting a goal because you don't know what your strategy is anymore. You've got to make sure that you have a coherent strategy and align your company and your resources, your people behind that strategy to achieve those goals. You revisit your strategy every year. You revisit your measurements against that strategy and your targets, and if those all make sense. So you can't be everything to everybody. If you are, you're not going to be successful. I thought that was a really great question. But I fully agree. I'll use that saying you said, a first cousin of Duncan's, and saying like, pick a few things, get really good at it, and then you can think about other things, as long as it's contributing to your overall strategy.
Yeah, I'm going to echo this point. We often think about priorities as what we prioritize, not why we prioritize. And I think a lot of the discussion on the panel today is around the why something matters enough to stay a priority. And if something is important enough to remain a priority, the what may change, might evolve as we deliver on. But giving issues the attention they deserve, keeping them on that front burner is allowing organizations to move forward. I think it's so, we often think about prioritizing issues. We often say prioritizing issues, but we often look at prioritizing outcomes. And I think somewhere in between, the leaders play this massive balancing act by shifting attention towards courses of action and making sure that attention remains loyal to those courses of action as they develop over time.
I think we have time for one more question from our audience, and especially I think for Duncan and JP, who are dealing with many organizations on a daily basis. Within a company, how do you influence what Duncan said about honesty, not staying silent, being accountable, etc. At the senior leadership level, they have a board and shareholders, hedge funds, private equities to answer to, who mostly are concerned with quick profitability. So Duncan and JP, how are you dealing with your boards and shareholders?
Our board takes this really seriously. It's actually our audit committee that has oversight for ESG. But it's very similar to the last question, so I'll keep this one short. Their view is, tell us what your priorities are. Let's align on them. Let's put metrics about them and execute them. In fact, interestingly, as we do enterprise risk management, we do a management team survey of like the top 40 risks that we've identified in the company. and the ranking that we give them as an executive team, and the board does the same ranking. And our executive team puts ESG issues, somewhere in the teens in terms of its force rank. Our board puts ESG in the top 3 to top 5, depending on the year. So like our board cares about making progress, but they want to see a few priorities. They want to see the intended destination. They want to see the metrics that they can judge us by. And then they want quarterly updates to execute against it.
AP?
Yeah. It's not as someone has been talking as well, it's not an either or. And, we've had Rich Kruger as our CEO now for over coming on 2 years soon. He's extraordinarily, to run a company like Suncor, you've got to be an extraordinarily bright guy, but he's also charismatic and pragmatic in some ways. The board, we really keep an eye on the balance of, making sure that our shareholders are happy, because, we've had Elliot at our doorstep as an activist shareholder because we were failing when it came to our operations, our productivity. But once you start to understand that it aligns, when you align good operations, which means you're going to have less spills, less environmental issues, more efficient operations, which is going to reduce your carbon footprint. You're sending up people home safely every night from operations, better than they were when they started, because they've got great jobs and community around them. Then you start to realize that you can have both by concentrating on those core strategy, by making sure everybody in your ELT, to the question about keeping everybody accountable to each other. It's about, in what we do in our organization is there's no tiers. It's like you are one organization. We have one set of values. We want to be safe. We need to be operational excellence. And we're going to get to reduction in carbon through our practices. And there's still, lots of work to do in there. I'm not saying we're anywhere near the end yet. But that's how you're going to keep your shareholders happy. That's how you're going to keep your company profitable. And that's how you're going to deal with many of the environmental and social issues that we, as any kind of natural resource company, has to deal with to make sure they're in line with the stakeholders and rights holders within their backyards. You've got to be good at business before you can be good at anything else.
Okay, thank you. We're going to do our last round, which is your final recommendation to our audience. And we have also some students. I can see, because from the questions, we have some HBA and MBA students also watching. And so what would you tell our students? I'm going to start with Oana. What would you tell our students, Oana, in terms of being the leaders of ESG? What would you recommend them?
I would emphasize that as leaders today and tomorrow, they are essential in integrating, translating, and transforming the many pressures on the environment and on society to priorities on their boards and on their leadership teams. And as leaders, they have their own characters and their own values to rely on, but the work is to integrate many others' values and goals as they lead the path forward.
Thank you. Duncan, your final message to our audience, recommendation for ESG leaders.
To be an effective ESG leader, you're going to need to influence a lot of people without direct authority to force outcomes. You're going to have to navigate organizations and navigate internal politics and be seen as a credible leader. And this might be an unpopular answer, but I'll give it to you. The doing nothing but ESG your entire life may not make you the most credible leader when you get into large size organizations. I started in communications and government relations, which led me into investor relations. I became a marketer. I was on acquisition teams. I was involved in store ops, restaurant ops, supply chain. I'm currently on the board of Popeye's supply chain organization in the US.
Yeah, that's great.
JP.
Yeah, this is great advice. One of the best teachers is experience, and even like as Duncan was just talking about, like having the experience across functions within an organization or sectors is really important. Do what you can to engross yourself and stretch yourself and feel a little uncomfortable about the environments that you're working in so that you can enrich your life and your experience. With that in mind, one of my major issues with big cities, and I live up north. I lived in Toronto for 7 years. I lived in Ottawa. I spent a lot of time in the big cities. Is that there's such a disconnect between our northern communities where I'm from, not only First Nations and Métis and Inuit communities, but northern communities and the big cities. There's just such a disconnect that it creates challenges in understanding and bridging the values and the aspirations and the policies and the business practices between the urban and rural communities. I just gave this speech at Carleton so long ago when I was receiving an honorary doc, and I challenged all of the recent graduates to go, maybe postpone your trip to Europe. Maybe go up north and spend time in northern communities to understand your own country that you live in, so that you can be a better leader. Because going back to my thoughts around experience, when the leaders in your organization ask you about these issues, and you're sitting next to one of your colleagues and they've never experienced it, but you have, and you can speak to your experience and the truth that you put that experience through your own lens, that is going to make you a more effective leader. So spend more time in other parts of the country than just the big cities are great. I mean, me personally, I'm kind of tired of big cities. I love living up north where the water's clean and the air is fresh. And I can go moose hunting and supply myself with all of my own fish and meat and Whopper burgers from moose. Spend time up north if you can. You'll be enriched for it, I promise.
Thank you. Thank you for all these points of advice for our leaders and students watching us, and for all these examples of leadership in action in the ESG space, and for reminding us to not only focus on what leaders know and do, but also who they are, how they show up to implement ESG. As we come to the end of today's conversation, I want to extend a big thank you to our panelists, JP Gladu, Duncan Fulton, and Oana Branzei, for generously sharing their time and expertise on this important topic. I would also like to thank everyone who joined us online today, from wherever you are around the world. If you would like to revisit this conversation or share it with your network, we'll send you a video link early next week. Thank you also to everybody at Ivey Events, Ivey Communications, Ivey CTS, and Inatowicz Leadership Institute who made this event possible. Please don't forget to mark your calendars for Ivey's online Character Leadership Conference, which is in November 6th of this year, and it's entitled Cultivating Hope for a Flourishing World. And we will explore how to cultivate hope, foster mutual respect, build connections, and it's going to build on many of the topics of today. We will have 2 keynote addresses by globally renowned thought leaders, Adam Kahane, Wendy Smith, Michael Lamb. We will have 3 interactive workshops with Ivey professors. And again, it's an opportunity to continue this conversation. And then I also wanted to say to you that you will have an opportunity to complete a post-event survey. As an extra incentive, you will get a $50 Amazon gift card for 1 lucky survey participant. So don't wait, and please fill the survey now. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to connecting with you again. Bye.